If you're looking for insight into the vast world of information security, then you're in the right place. Welcome to the InfoSecSync podcast, the only top-rated information security podcast committed to helping you enhance your cyber skill set. Listen in on conversations with world-class information security thought leaders, subject matter experts, authors, and more as we exchange ideas, best practices, and discuss the latest trends, threats, strategies, and solutions for your success. So get ready to get in sync with your host, Nick Thomas.
Hey, Myles Brown, thanks for taking the time out to join us on InfoSecSync. How are you doing today, sir?
Me on, Nick.
Hey, no worries. Always like to get the subject matter experts on that know what they're talking about. First thing I want to ask you that I ask all my guests on the show, so the listeners and viewers will know the person deeper. How did you fall into cyber and the role that you're currently doing at Tech Data as cloud subject matter expert, DevOps, etc.? How did that start for Mr. Myles?
Sure. Well, right out of college, I got a job as a programmer, as a mainframe programmer. I maybe don't look that old, but this was it was actually a ladies' wear company that was really about distribution of product, and they had mid-range computers, AS400s, and I got there when they were sort of at a time in flux where they started to bring in client-server kind of technologies. And so we were getting rid of the green screens and giving people PCs, and the data that we were collecting was no longer going to be just in the mainframe. We started to find other types of data storage, and I got in there right at the right time, and I was kind of young and hungry, and so they let me run with every project that I could come up with. And so I really became more of a data person and started our first data warehouse. Data warehousing was just starting to become a thing in the mid-90s. And so that was really my start. And we moved and started using Oracle databases. And so I really became an Oracle database expert, I would say. More so when I left there and started teaching Oracle courses. And so I've kind of gone back and forth in my career between working with technologies and then going and teaching classes for, the vendor authorized classes. So, I started teaching with Oracle, and then I went back and I became more of a Java developer, and then I got a job teaching Java for a Sun training partner. And I kind of kept going back and forth like that. And as I became more of a database programmer, when Hadoop came to the forefront in the sort of mid to late 2000s, I became a Hadoop guy. Did a lot of Cloudera distribution stuff, still on-prem at that point, although I had heard people were starting to use the cloud. And eventually, not every place I would go and consult had 100 Linux boxes sitting around that they could build a Hadoop cluster with. And so we started to use EC2 instances from AWS. So that's what they call their virtual machines. And so it was very sort of from first principles. You would get a bunch of virtual machines in the cloud and then go and install, all your Hadoop components. And then eventually it got easier. And then the cloud vendors started to really embrace it. And so at that point, I became a cloud guy. My entryway was AWS, and that's still primarily what I deal with. But then I got into Google Cloud as well. A lot less so with Microsoft Azure, although I've definitely dealt with it in projects. But I've gone back and forth, like I said, back to training. And so, currently I'm with a company called ExitCertified, which is part of Tech Data, and really on and off with them for a long time now. I like coming back to the training. It's very personal. Sometimes as a consultant, you're stuck in a corner and said, hey, go work on this. And, I need the people part as well. And so I find training, you really get in there and talk to people. So it's kind of been back and forth a little bit. And so that's how I became a cloud guy.
So that's amazing. And what's amazing about that is you started off as an IBM AS400 guy, which technically back then was the cloud.
Yeah, I guess.
You went to desktops, right? You went to Novell, you went to Microsoft, then you started going into big data with Oracle, and now you're coming back around into, guess what? The cloud again.
Yeah,
except it's not the AS400s anymore. It's big servers and quantum computing.
Yeah, it's funny because we still sometimes talk to customers. I talk to customers who are trying to make a jump from mainframe into cloud, and I say, well, you're sort of skipping over 20 years of technology there that you didn't do,
Absolutely.
But it's interesting how many mainframes are still out there, and how that sort of centralization of the processing and the data, we've come back around to it because the cloud sort of ends up doing that again. And you live long enough in this industry, everything's cyclical, I think.
Yeah, it's coming back to the data storage, the warehousing, and power, space, and cooling that it always was in the beginning.
Yeah, although it looks like a big monolith to us, but under the covers, that the cloud vendors are actually duplicating data across all kinds of data centers and everything. So it's really just, it looks the same as far as we're concerned, but it's actually a lot more resilient under the covers.
InfoSecSync is brought to you by Excelio. Excelio provides economic, end-to-end cybersecurity threat detection and response solutions designed for your team, environment, and security objectives, providing packet-level visibility across your network. Visit them on the web at excelio.com. That's AXELLIO.com.
So, Myles, some of the cloud providers nowadays are Amazon, right? We've got Microsoft with Azure. We have Google Cloud. And now one of your current employers, Oracle, has a cloud now. So taking all of these into account, tell us a little bit more about your expertise in one over the other. Why, first off, why is this such a massive trend, right? And then what are people picking mainly these days, or is it a hodgepodge? How does somebody know, or just a regular person, which one of these vendors should they go with?
So it is a massive trend, right? So over the last 10 years, we've seen, enterprises adopt cloud, but really over the last 5 years especially. And, the way I saw it, in the early days, what I saw, AWS marketing was, hey, if you're a startup, you don't want to blow all your money building data centers around the world, right? And so that goal of no upfront costs and just pay as you go, pay for what you need, right? That's very attractive to a startup. And so a lot of those companies that were startups, when AWS was first going, they're now, huge established companies that completely changed their industry. People like Netflix and Airbnb and all these kinds of companies. But then once enterprises start to see this, they start to say, hey, is the cloud something we would be interested in? And I think the big idea is, if you've got a bunch of data centers, you see a huge cost there. And when you take in the total cost of all the people running it and leasing land and everything, when one of those data centers is got to be refreshed and we got to buy all new equipment, that's a huge outlay of capital. And so this idea of trading capital expenditure for operating expenses, a monthly fee, is very attractive, even if you weren't to save money. But then because of the economies of scale that the cloud vendors get, then there's some real benefit there. And so it's very attractive, not just for startups, but for enterprises. And then eventually even we started to see a lot of the public sector move to it, right? And so it has been a huge trend. And now we see, most Fortune 500 companies have some presence in the cloud, if not a large presence. But when it comes to choosing which vendor, because like you said, there are 4 or 5 viable contenders, what we see is that AWS is by far the biggest market share because they got in first, right? They started, they actually started before 2006, but 2006 is when EC2 and S3 came out, and that's when they sort of spun it off as a separate company, AWS, and that's 5 years before, well, it was 2010 and 2011 when Microsoft Azure and Google Cloud came out. So in that, 5 years, they really got a good head start. And once Microsoft Azure came out, they had the advantage that most major companies already have some sort of agreement with Microsoft because of Windows, because of Office 365, right? And so, they've already got a business arrangement with them. So if they're going into the cloud, that might be the easiest, path for not having to go through legal and everything else again. And so, we see a lot of companies, especially companies that are, sort of Microsoft shops. Like if all your development is in .NET, all your databases are SQL Server, well then going to Microsoft for the cloud makes a lot of sense, right? And so they gather up a lot of the market that way. Google Cloud is like really a third place vendor, like by far third place, because it looks a lot like AWS, a lot of the same terminology and everything else. But I think that their marketing was sort of, hey, if you're going to go multi-cloud, don't put all your eggs in one basket. You should have a second cloud vendor as your backup. And we are great at being that. I literally saw that when I went to Google Cloud Next a couple of years ago. It was kind of jarring because I had gone to an AWS event the week before, and then I was at a Google Cloud event, and the marketing could not have been more different. AWS was starting to say, hey, don't spread your cloud spend around. Spend it all with one vendor, and then you have the most buying power, right? Because if you're going to spend a lot of money with one cloud vendor, you should be able to get a better deal than just the regular rates. But
I agree. Anyone can agree with that, right?
But then Google Cloud is saying, no, you don't put all your eggs in one basket, But it was obviously because one was the market leader trying to hold on to that, and one was trying to gain market share. But this idea of multi-cloud has become very, very popular. And, when you get an outage, like this week we had, the big Facebook outage, and, that scares people. And they say, what if my cloud vendor goes down? Now, most of the cloud vendors don't go down very often. AWS, for example, doesn't go down unless something really bad happens where, they had one sort of outage for about 6 hours because of their DNS or whatever. It wasn't their outage, it was a supplier of theirs, and you realize how much of the internet relies on, this cloud vendor, and you say, I can't have that. And so there's lots of reasons to go multi-cloud these days. And, but there's still, each vendor has their sort of hotspot, what they do well. And you'll see some people go to Oracle Cloud. Oracle Cloud has won a few major contracts, and it's really because of, they do pricing a little differently. Most cloud vendors, you don't pay any data transfer fee to move data into their cloud, but when you grab data from the cloud storage and pull it back, that's when you pay a data transfer fee.
So that's one of the things I wanted to ask you with, especially with Oracle, because you were an Oracle guy. Why would I want to go to Oracle versus AWS or Azure?
Well, I would say, there's a couple things at play here. If you're running like an Oracle database and you want a managed service where you don't have to worry about the operating system and patches and all that kind of thing, you want it to be sort of self-managed, well then obviously Oracle's going to do a great job of managing Oracle databases, just like Microsoft does a great job of managing Microsoft SQL Server, But I would say AWS does a pretty good job of managing about 6 different databases, but it might not be as good, at certain things. But the big selling point, I'd say, for Oracle Cloud is their data transfer pricing. And so we've seen a couple of big customers, like Zoom kind of signed a big deal with Oracle Cloud, I guess, some point last year, and people said, "Oh wow, is Oracle Cloud on the map now?" And you say, "Well, think about what Zoom does in the cloud. It's all data transfer." And so they're sort of a, kind of like a single issue voter, right? And so they're most worried about data transfer, and Oracle kills everybody else on that pricing. And so for them, it made a lot of sense. What I find is that, if most people go where the crowd goes, AWS is popular and nothing draws a crowd like a crowd.
So another question I wanted to ask you, I was reading an Accenture paper recently, and it mentioned that 90% of enterprises are going to the cloud, but however, out of those 90%, only 20 to 30% of their 20 to 40% of their workload is they're utilizing for the cloud. Any idea why that would be?
Yeah, I've seen that trend too, where we see, hey, everybody says we're in the cloud, but when you delve into it and you say, what percentage of your workloads are in the cloud? Like production workloads, it's not that high, not as high as they would like. And there's kind of a couple things that go on with that. One of them is, most of these organizations that go to the cloud, they already have an existing infrastructure, right? So they have data centers, and they might be able to shut some down, but they have long-term contracts for others. Plus, they have things that don't easily move to the cloud. Like if they do have mainframe stuff, it's not like you can go and move all your mainframes to the cloud. You have to redesign those apps. That takes time, right? So there's some low-hanging fruit, dev and test environments. People move to the cloud pretty easily. Anything non-mission critical, you move that to the cloud quickly. But then, you get into, hey, security and compliance. What does this mean? Can I move this? Some of those things you have to investigate for a while. And so there's a lot of workloads still running in people's own data centers. And it's sort of, there's a couple of reasons for that. One, we said, was some of that infrastructure exists and you're just not going to throw it away because you already bought all these physical machines and have these buildings. Some of it is workloads that don't easily move to the cloud until you redesign them completely. And the third is not everybody has the skill set to move to the cloud right away, right? You can have your sort of, the bleeding edge people that end up becoming your cloud center of excellence, and they could take a couple apps, move them into the cloud and say, see, it works. But then to get your, massive group of developers and architects and system operations people, security people on board, like everybody's got to be on board to move all these other workloads. That can take some time. And so what we find is that, I've read some studies where they say, 80% of the cloud leaders say that an unskilled workforce is their biggest impediment to cloud adoption, right? And so trying to get those cloud skills is a big thing.
And that's a good question. And let me pull that thread there because you do a lot of training. What are some of the gaps that you're seeing there? Obviously, the cloud training gap is one of the ones you're seeing, right? So
there's a lot of options for learning about the cloud, right? There's a lot of free online stuff. There's low cost things. The gold standard usually for training is instructor-led training, where you're live in class. Although these days, not too many people are going into a classroom, but, virtual over Zoom or whatever. We see a lot of that. The company that I work for, we switched from about 60% virtual to 100% virtual when COVID hit. And people are used to that and it works pretty well, but at least you have a live person to ask questions of, and follow up. So there's a lot of good training out there that is, coming from the vendors themselves. So all those Amazon, Microsoft, Google Cloud, Oracle, IBM, go down the list of everybody with a cloud, and they've got their own training, and it's chunked up to 3-day or 5-day classes or whatever. And so that first level of just getting somebody basic training in the cloud, that is readily available, right? If somebody's a, self-starter and can do the online kind of, self-paced training. For some people that works really well. Other people, they say, hey, I need 3 days away from work where nobody's bothering me, where I've got nothing to do but listen to this instructor and then go work with some hands-on. A lot of people work and respond better to that. But the real problem I find is that a move to the cloud is almost never done in isolation. What we see when people are doing their digital transformation, I find that there's three things that go hand in hand in hand. One is a move of the platform. So they're going from on-prem to the cloud. Next, they're starting to adopt like a DevOps kind of culture, right? Because when we move to the cloud, you're letting your cloud vendor do more of the low-level stuff. So there's less and less operations. So all of a sudden, DevOps becomes a little bit easier. You can take a developer who knows a little bit about security and a little bit about networking and make them a full-stack developer. And that really, makes DevOps go nicely. And then the third sort of trend we see is a change in architecture from big monolithic apps being broken up into microservices. And so that kind of goes nicely with DevOps as well, because instead of here's a development team that builds the code and then throws it over to the wall to the operations people, and then there's just a bunch of pointing of fingers of when things go wrong. Now we have small cross-functional teams with a few developers, a couple of testers, maybe one or two operations people, and they're in charge of a set of microservices from end to end.
Much better. It makes your agile environment a lot better.
That's really what it is. It's taking that idea of agile, like all those agile programming things that I learned in the 90s, and just extending it through the entire software development lifecycle. And so that's where we're going with this. And so we see a lot of people make those moves. And so just taking a 3 or a 5 day class from your cloud vendor, that teaches you about that cloud tool. But it doesn't teach you about how are we really going to make this digital transformation, And
how we're going to use it properly for...
how are we going to get our leadership to understand that embracing DevOps means we have to totally change how we build and run teams, right? Then we have to think about building that automated CI/CD pipeline for DevOps, and what are the tools we're going to choose. So there's sort of the theory of building it, and then there's what's our particular tool set look like, right? And then, how are you going to implement your microservices? These days, Docker and Kubernetes are becoming wildly popular, right? So you might go that way. The other way to go that the cloud vendors really provide is this idea of serverless. All the cloud vendors have the similar idea where you say, hey, I'm a developer. I'm going to write this piece of code, and it responds to some sort of an event. And I'm never going to think about where is this code running, how many servers are running it. I don't think about any of that. I just say, here's the code, and here's the event that causes it to run. And so that's become sort of the sexiest thing in the cloud these days.
And also the use of the vendor tools that they offer you, right? They can offer the same thing in the cloud. Jenkins, Hadoop, all that.
Yeah, that's the big thing. When I look today, if I open up the AWS Management Console and I think about what it looked like 10 years ago when I opened it up, 10 years ago there was about 8 things in that list. Now it's over 200. Yeah. And I can't even imagine opening that up and saying, I got to learn all this. You don't, right? There are so many services that are really niche. Like you mentioned, quantum computing, AWS has a service for launching satellites, and I look at that, I'm like, that's not my job. I'm never going to touch that.
Are we good with that here?
So a lot of the services are what we would call managed services. So something like Hadoop or even a database, you say, well, all I need is a bunch of virtual machines and I can go and install stuff and manage them the way I want. Well, AWS says, sure, if you want to do that, go ahead. But we also have this managed service where you just come in and say, hey, I want Hadoop with 100 nodes. And then they go and launch it. And if one dies, it comes back up, right? And so it makes your life easier. It's less administration, right? And so the total cost of ownership ends up being quite a bit lower. And so that is really one of the big value prospects of the cloud, is not just that we can get virtual machines, but now we can tap into their expertise in managing them and automating things so that we don't have to do as much low level, And right. Bringing it back to security, the less manual processes we have, the better, right?
Yeah, that was another question I wanted to ask you. Are you seeing a lot of these companies baking security in where you can choose security?
Yeah.
How's that
Yeah.
working
So
in the cloud?
again, I'll use AWS as the example because it's the most popular and it's the one I know best. But they all have kind of the same concepts. In AWS, they've introduced all kinds of services where, they'll do something like, they've got something called Inspector, right? And it's an agent that you can install on all your virtual machines. And every once in a while, you can say, hey, I want to go run an inspection. And it says, okay. And it talks to the agent and says, what's running on all these virtual machines? What version of Windows or Linux is running? What are all the pieces of software? What version of those software? And then it reports it back, and it looks against a list of known vulnerabilities that Amazon themselves maintain, right? So this is something that in past, I've been at companies where that was somebody's job to maintain a list of known vulnerabilities. And now what we're saying is, hey, you don't have to do that. That's duplication. Amazon already does that. And so now they've got this tool, and it can just do an inspection whenever you want, and it'll say, okay, hey, you've got these machines, they're running this version of Linux, you're missing this patch, and there's some critical security holes there, right? And so that's the kind of thing where you're buying their expertise. They have similar stuff for, distributed denial of service attacks and things like that, where they'll, you pay something like $3,500 a month for this service, but if you consider, hey, if I had to hire just one person who knows how to deal with incident management of a distributed denial of service, it would cost me more than that. And so there's a lot of those kinds of things. They've subtly introduced a lot of services that have machine learning, where they're sort of they're proactive. They go and they look and they say, hey, I'm looking in all your cloud storage. I'm looking across all your S3. And I found these files, and it looks to me like you've got social security numbers that are not obfuscated in some way. That probably goes against some kind of compliance, And so they use machine learning to figure out, hey, that's what a social security number looks like, right? And then they tell you about it, and that's not even, that's a proactive thing that you just say, hey, go scan every week for this stuff. And so
that's great. So it's sort of like built-in RMF or NIST compliance in the cloud.
That's exactly. And so, what we find is that the cloud vendors, they look at each other, right? So that was something that I think Azure introduced something like that first, and then all of a sudden Amazon says, oh, now we've got that too, right? So whatever differentiated one from another in the past, they're starting to get closer and closer. They're borrowing all the best ideas from one another, and they're just looking at, hey, what are popular third-party tools people are running on top of our cloud? And then they look for, is that something we can implement automatically in the cloud? And so I think the value proposition of the cloud just gets better and better over time as they add more and more of these sort of higher level services for us.
Great. Awesome. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you, when you're not doing all the stuff that you do in your home, where would we find you on the web? What sites are you on? What are you keeping up with? What are you doing?
Yeah, there's a couple things I do. There's a newsletter that I use called Last Week in AWS. He's very snarky, because he doesn't work for AWS. He could tell you about all the news and give his spin on what he thinks of it. So I find that's a great one. I would say that for the most part, it's a lot of newsletters. I like the sort of, hey, just email it to me and I'll read it when I can, because I'm not a every day go and check certain websites kind of person. Because I find that sometimes I still teach classes. So, that throws me off compared to my normal day. And so I'm old school. I get it all emailed to me through newsletters. I've got a few different ones like that I go through. I also attend a lot of conferences. That's a big part of my job is to stay current. And so I go to all the cloud conferences. A lot of times I'm sort of maybe running our booth at a bigger one. But what I find is that all those conferences, these days they're usually both virtual and online. So if you can't go, that's fine. You just watch all the content you want, right? But I find that walking around the expo floor, like I go to AWS reInvent every year, and I just walk the floor and I talk to people at every booth and find out what their product does. And, they give you the sales pitch, and you don't get all the downside to everything until later you read more about it. But that's how I really keep abreast is, walking around seeing. So I only see the ones that have money to spend money on a booth, I guess. That's the only downside there.
Right. So being in person at RSA is much better than watching it.
Yeah, I would say that. Yeah.
So, Myles, I'd like to thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us today. And thanks for staying in sync with InfoSecSync.
All right, thank you.
That's it for this episode. Make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. And as always, thanks for staying in sync with InfoSecSync.